Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephen. I'm a traditionally published fantasy author. Today I'm doing another monthly Q&A, answering your questions, and then for the second half I'm going to be debunking some more traditional publishing advice from experts online. So hold on to your hat for that bit. There will be some adult language following, but only when I get to that section I will warn you. So let's start with the first question that somebody has sent in. How much dialogue is too much in a novel? I recently heard from an agent that you should use dialogue sparingly, and there's a bit more to the question. Someone basically said they don't want to limit how much dialogue they use because they feel like it would be an info dump. So my advice is that I think that agent needs to basically go and read some books, because you can't really have a fiction novel without dialogue. And there are some authors I know that write the dialogue first, because that is the drive of the story, the conversation between the characters. So no, you shouldn't use dialogue sparingly. If you are writing a history novel, or if you're writing, non-fiction, then you're probably not going to have any dialogue because it's all going to be facts and dates. But for fiction, characters talk, they interact, they argue, they have conflict. Therefore, you need to have dialogue. It can't all just be an internal monologue the entire time. So I'm not sure where that agent got that idea from, but I would basically say ignore that advice because I don't think it's very good at all. The next question is, what are your top tips for editing your own work during the revision process? Okay, so my advice is there are a number of different ways you can do this. This is just how I do it, but these are some ideas that you could play around with and see which ones work for you. They may not, some of them might. It's really up to you to just experiment and find whatever is comfortable for you. So what I would suggest is you do sweeps of the novel. Once you finish that first draft and you've given it a bit of space and you come back and you start to revise it and try and improve it, you could try and work through the book from the beginning to the end, doing everything at once, but that's really, really difficult. What I tend to do is focus on one aspect. So as we just said, dialogue. If you want to try and get the voice of your characters really right, or you want to make sure that the dialogue feels realistic, I would do a sweep of the entire book focusing on dialogue. Read the dialogue out loud. How does it sound to your ear? And sometimes when the process of doing that, I hear the odd stumble, or I naturally fall into a rhythm and think, oh, a comma should go there because that's how it should work. Or sometimes I put more contractions in because somebody may not always say, I will go and do this. You'll say, I'll go and do this. So to make it flow a little better, I do things like that. And with fantasy books, that's what I write. The next thing I might do might be a world building sweep. I might sort of say, right, is there too much? Is there not enough information about this particular place, this race, this city? What does it feel like? I've done some world building videos on fantasy books and fantasy world building and cities and stuff like that. So I might do something like that. Is the character of the city coming through on a page? Does it feel different, or is it exactly the same as every other place that they visit? So that might be something else I might look at. Another thing to look at is the plot. Is the pacing working? How's the structure? Does it kind of dip and then get really slow in the middle and then pick up at the end? Some people can kind of say the start is exciting, the end is really good, and the middle kind of dips. So what could you do if that was the case when your book you're looking through? What could you do to tighten it up or make the middle more interesting? Or is the pace really just slow at the start of the book, but it gets really good by chapter 10? Then obviously you need to do something. You need to work on the start of the book to get going. I mean, you don't have to have a murder on page 1, something drastic and terrible happens on page 1, but there needs to be something to make people keep reading on, to give them an idea of what the book is about. So that's something else you could look at. So rather than trying to do everything all at once in one edit, which would be really, really intense, I would say kind of do it in layers or stages, working your way through the book. The other thing to remember is, as you're doing all of these sweeps, you'll naturally start to pick up other things. So whether it's punctuation or grammar or other little tweaks that you'll find as you go through, I kind of tend to pick them up. So when I go back, when I'm editing something, I may start on a chapter and I'm reading it through and trying to process it, my fingers will just kind of like start fixing little things on the keyboard, like, oh, I'll move that word here, or I change this dialogue here and it feels a little bit better, a little bit organic when I'm doing something else. But I'm usually focused on one thing when I'm doing that. So by constantly going through the book and doing all of these things and revising them one at a time, it will improve the overall flow of the novel. And I think that's only going to be a good thing. So try some of those ideas, see what works for you. So the next question is, besides having a day job, reading books and writing your own books, have you got any time for being a normal human being, social life, other hobbies and so on? So what the question was really, how do you combine all of this? So that's a really good question. All about sacrifice, it's all about balance. Now with so much TV on demand and stuff, if there's something that I really want to watch, I can just park it on a shelf and come back to it. It's not like when I was growing up, if you didn't watch the episode of that thing when it was on, you missed it, or you'd have to VCR it and watch it later. But then again, everyone will be talking about it the next day in school or at work, so you had to watch it when it was out. Now, you don't really need to do that, or I might get up a little bit earlier and do some writing, or stay up late an extra hour and do some writing, or whatever it might be. So it's all about balance. In some ways, it's slightly easier before you're published because you don't have a deadline. You don't have something that's kind of fixed in stone. And yes, there are some authors who just kind of see their deadline and it just sails past them and they kind of forget about it, but they can get away with it. They're the minority. Most authors deliver their books on time. So constantly having that at the back of my mind drives me forward, and also you get into a rhythm when you're working. But before you're published, you've got a bit more flexibility. If you want to take a month off, you can. So it is a challenge. It is about making sacrifices, and it's about giving up something that you cherish to spend the time writing. But let's be honest, the reason you're writing is that you love it and it's something that you want to do. So it's all about, what do you want to do more? Do you want to spend this hour watching TV or something, or do you want to go and do some writing? So balance, that's about all I can say really. The next question is there anything you do to take care of your wrists, or have you ever experienced any wrist pain? So I have a little bit, but not as much. Some of my friends have more severe wrist pain, and what they've bought are fingerless compression gloves that you can buy. You'll be able to find them online, and they're supposed to be really, really good to support your wrist and your hands, especially if you spend a lot of time writing. It should hopefully restrict any kind of carpal tunnel syndrome from developing. So have a look, do some Googling online, and I think you'll find something. Icing your hands can also kind of help with that sort of thing. Okay, hold on to your hats now. The next bit of this video is going to be blunt talk, so if there is anybody underage, I suggest you pause this video and come back later, because I may end up using some adult language. So, to be clear, I'm going to be debunking information and advice, so-called advice, given by so-called experts online, who are obviously showing a great bias towards traditional publishing, and they want you to go self-publishing. To be clear, this isn't anything against self-publishing. These are against these people online who don't actually know what they're talking about. Here we go. So one video I saw, and I'm going to read out the word for word so you get exactly what this person said. They claimed that if the publisher wants to change something in the manuscript, they have the final say on it. This is one of the biggest cons of traditional publishing. That is absolute bullshit, and let's get into why. Given that the advice said the manuscript, that suggests to me it's the editor and therefore it's not anybody else. So when they buy the book from you, or you sign a contract for however many books, let's just say it's one book, you've given them, your agent has given them the manuscript, they've read it, and they've bought that idea, essentially. They bought into what you've given them. Now they may want to refine that idea, but they've bought into your vision of the book. So saying that they have the final say just isn't true at all, because they're not buying something to then take it off into another direction. But let's explore that. Tied into this is the next expert bit of advice from a self-published author. Fancy that. And they've said the publisher is looking for a particular type of book to fit into a particular type of mold. So that is true, because when you send in your fantasy book, your science fiction book, your romance book, whatever it is, they're looking for a particular style of book to fit the genre, to fit the market, and to fit the sort of general feel of those books. So, for example, fantasy is typically anywhere from 80 to, say, standard is 200,000. Anything above that, you do get. The sweet spot is somewhere between 80 and 150. If you go in with a 500,000 word book, that isn't really comfortable, and as a debut that's really expensive to print, so therefore it doesn't fit within the mold. Yes, now it might be brilliant and it might be an exception to the rule, but going in with that is a huge risk. So your agent would have to have something really special and say this is the best thing ever in the world. So in a particular mold? Kind of. More, what will the market expect? What will the market accept in terms of the readers, the bookstores, and everybody else who wants to read that kind of a book? The other thing to think about is, let's say you've done a book on horse racing, and you go to the publisher, your agent says it's really good, it's brilliant, they take it to this publisher and they say, well, we've just published 4 books in the last 3 years on horse racing and none of them have sold very well. Therefore, we don't think, as much as we read your book and we think it's quite good and we like it, given that the market has shown this isn't selling at the moment, therefore we're not going to take it. Now that's just good business sense. If they take another one and take another gamble, then they're probably going to lose money. They could offer you a smaller advance than you might expect you would get normally, and therefore it's less of a risk. But equally, there's still not a very good chance it's going to sell. You're not going to earn out. You're not going to get very good sales. So why would you go in with something that's such high risk if the market has said readers just aren't interested in this at the moment? Also, going back to the thing of editors will change it. Clearly, if they've taken on this book, they're not going to go, right, we're going to take on your horse racing book, but let's change it. Now let's make it a science fiction book or a romance book, because why? That makes no sense whatsoever. They're buying into the vision of the book that you've taken to them. If it's something that's currently going quite well, or they think it's going to sell well, or has potential to sell well because it's quite unique and different in the market, that's why they take on your book. Another thing I thought of, there's a possibility for why this editor has final say, is let's say they wanted to change the age range. So you've gone in with a YA book and they've said, okay, we want to make this adult fantasy. I've heard this happen a couple of times. Not many, but a couple of times. And there again, it still comes down to the author having the final say. Let's say, I know this for a fact, the YA market is selling very, very well, it's very popular, and there's a lot going on. Let's say you wrote a fantasy novel with a teen protagonist, but it was aimed at adults. And if your publisher came and said to you, right, this is kind of on the border, it's very close to being YA, but it's also, you've placed it very firmly in fantasy. How would you feel about making it a more closely a YA marketed book, shaving off some of the harder edges, because we think, 1, the market is much bigger, 2, it would sell really better than if you'd sold it as adult fantasy. Now there again, that comes down to you. You'd have the conversation with your agent, you'd talk it through, and you'd make that decision. What people seem to kind of forget, whether you're self-publishing or doing traditional publishing, as much as it's a creative endeavour, it's also a business. And if it makes more business sense that you're going to sell more copies, have a bigger audience, have a bigger market, have a bigger debut, would you not want to do that from a business perspective? And you might say, creatively it's not as satisfying, or it doesn't tell the true story that I want to, and that maybe you can say, well, actually, in book 2 it's going to be much darker and it really gets into the grim dark territory, and in book 3 it's even darker still. At that point, you'd have that conversation with your agent and then with your editor, and at that point they might say, okay, I can see why, yes, we'll keep it in fantasy, in adult fantasy. But it's up to you. It's absolutely up to you. The editor doesn't have final say. The next thing I tried to think of why this editor would have final say is, let's say they want to change genre. I've never heard of that. I've never heard of someone saying, really like your horror book, let's make it a comedy. That doesn't happen. So that's out the window for what this editor might have final say on. The most obvious possibility of what this comment was supposed to say and supposed to suggest is that they have final say on the story, and that they will ask you to make significant changes to the book, and therefore they get to shape the story. Let's pretend for a second that this is true, this is what happens. It isn't. What they'd have to do is sign the contract with you saying, we're going to publish your book on this date, we've given you this much advance, here's the contract, here's the percentage, and your agent has read it through and studied it and they've agreed it and signed it off, right? And they say, right, now we'll get into the editing process and start working on the book. At that point, if your editor then turned around and said, right, now we're going to make huge changes to your book, we're going to do this, I want you to change this, I want you to change that, you can say no, because you have a contract that says you will deliver a book of approximately this length with this title at this date at this time in this genre. It's all there in ink. And if they want to change it, they'd have to change your contract, which would be ridiculous because they've just signed it. The other reason, of course, is you have an agent, and this is one of the brilliant things about having an agent. They are there to have those uncomfortable conversations with you. So if you get some editorial notes back and you're really not happy with them, and you've talked to your editor about them, and they're insisting on, we really need to make this change, you have that conversation with your agent and say, I'm not happy, this isn't what we agreed, this is what we said originally when I signed the contract. They were really keen on my idea, they said they loved it, but now they've changed their mind and they want to do all sorts of weird things with it, and I'm not comfortable. Your agent goes round their office, well, probably not physically these days, but goes around, gets them on the phone, and asks them what the bloody hell they're talking about. Why would you buy the vision of this book and then dramatically try and change it? They don't get to make that final decision. You do. You're the author. If your editor comes to you and says, I think the book is too dark, I think the market isn't ready for this at the moment, I'd like you to lighten the tone of the book and make it less severe. And if you say, no, I really want to stick with it, and they say, okay, you make the final decision on that. But here's the balance. If, when it then sells, and the editor has told you it isn't going to sell as well because it's too dark, and you didn't listen to them, you have to accept the consequences of that. So if they dramatically try to change your book, that's absolutely on you. I wouldn't want them to do that with mine, and I wouldn't let them do that with mine. If I'd written a comedy and they said, oh, can we make it much darker or something, I'd be like, no, it's not supposed to be that kind of a book. I would live with the consequences of the changes or not making the changes. So that's something you have to remember. It's all on you, either way. Just a reminder, they bought the book based upon the vision that you presented to them in the synopsis and the covering letter and what your agent has said to them, and then they've read the manuscript from start to finish and they've said, right, we love this, we want to buy this. What they're there to do, what your editor is there to do, is to bring a fresh set of eyes to the manuscript and to refine the vision of the book into something better. I'll give you an example. In my first book, Battle Mage, it's very much focused about a war, and I had this kind of side story that went off and it was about a serial killer, and there's all this cool stuff going on. And my editor came to me and said, this is all really good, but this side story, as interesting as I find it, it detracts from the clarity of the book. You've got a really strong theme in your book. It's all about power, the corruption of power, whether it's political or magic or something else, and that's all really tight and it all really works. But then you've got this serial killer thing and it doesn't mesh with the rest of the story. And she was right. Now I could have said, no, I'll keep it in. But on reflection, on listening to her and on reading it through, I realised she was right. And so I trimmed that out. It didn't dramatically change the story. It didn't change the thrust of the book. It didn't change the shape of the book. It made it better because they'd looked at what I was trying to do. They'd been able to take a step back and see my vision, but then try and clarify it based on what I've given to them. So your editor does not have final say. You have final say on your book, good or bad, but you have to live with the consequences of those decisions. Right, before I go on to the next question, I always forget to do this. So if you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe, give me a thumbs up. If you want to join the Headspace writing community, there's a link down below. It's a private Discord where writers and myself share work, we talk about it, we contribute, we comment, and we provide feedback, because that's one of the hardest things really when you're submitting, especially these days. I've heard from a lot of people submitting their books to agents. They just get ghosted and they don't know why the book isn't working, what's wrong with it. So if you want to join, that would be great. You'd be very, very welcome. The next piece of advice was about speed to market. And listen to the wording again to what they've said. With traditional publishing, it takes 2 to 3 years to get your book to a market at a minimum. This is a lie. This is a huge lie, and it's more nonsense and bias to say you must go down the self-publishing route. Typically, it takes a year for a book to be traditionally published from when it is picked up. If you don't believe me, go online and Google it. Go and look up the bookseller. Go and look at the deals section, and in there you'll see countless deals saying this publisher bought this book from this agent for this much in a deal of this many books. The first book will debut in this date, and it will tell you, it'll typically be the following calendar year. So saying it's 2 to 3 years as a minimum is just bullshit. It's just another lie. Now, it might be that, say you've written a romance book about horse racing. I seem to like horse racing today. Anyway, horse racing. And when you go to the publisher, they say, right, we've got another book on our list that's similar. The list is all of the books that that publisher is going to publish in the next 12 months or maybe 24 months. But usually they're looking immediately like the following year. So they come to you and say, right, we've got your book, we've signed you, we want to put your book out next year, but we've got another book that's very similar to you. So to give them both enough space so that the audience doesn't get them confused, so that they'll buy one, have some time, a long tail, kind of people buying it immediately when it first comes out. Tails might tail off for a bit, but you still get sales. And then we'll bring out your book and we'll get a big spike again, and then they'll tail off again. If you brought both books out really close to each other, there's a risk you'll split the audience, you'll split the sales. So what they might say is, right, we'll put theirs out in January and yours out in June. That's still within a year. It might be that they say, right, it's actually going to be, instead of 12 months time, it might be 16 months time. But it's still, you know exactly when it's going to happen and the reason why. But typically it will be 1 year. Now, yes, self-publishing is faster. You can write a book, work on it and get it out in 3 months. And then you can do it again if you can write another book fast as well and get it edited, cover, copyright, proof, all that kind of sort of stuff out and release it every 3 months. Yes, you can do that with self-publishing. But saying that it takes a minimum of 2 to 3 years for a traditionally published book to come out is just a lie. It's just more biased advice that these experts are giving. The next piece of expert advice was quite amusing to me because of the irony that just they didn't seem to notice. So what they said was, there are a lot of people who touch your book through the traditional publishing process. True. Here's the next bit that was the real killer for me. It's almost like editing or writing by committee. So what they've done is turn something that is basically a positive into a negative. Yes, a lot of people will touch your book, from your initial editor. It could be the person that's commissioned it, or it could be someone else. You have initial editor, then you might have a line editor, then you'll have someone who proofread it. But you'll have the same thing with self-publishing. How is that any different? How is that not also writing by committee? It's just the way they've phrased it to make it sound like, oh, traditional publishing is awful because you have no control, they tell you what to do, and your editor says change this, you have to change this. Whereas, a self-published editor won't make any comments at all? You're not going to listen to any of their advice, even if it's good advice? You should. So how is that any different at all? It's just more bullshit, again, to make it sound like traditional publishing is the worst thing in the world, when it's just really not. The next bit of expert advice to scare you off traditional publishing was around contracts. And this person said, traditional publishers have got a pass for years. They have devilish contracts, ironclad contracts. Traditional publishers have more attorneys than you've ever met. They are brutal and can destroy your career. This is just so much horseshit. It's just unbelievable. It makes this person sound like they're an expert on contracts, that they've gone through the process. And from what I've gathered from looking at the YouTube channel, they're a self-published person. They've never actually seen a traditional publishing contract. I mean, just the way they're saying, they've got more attorneys than you've ever met. How do you know? How do you know I don't work in a court all day? And I've met hundreds of lawyers. I might see them every day when I go to work. You don't fucking know. It's just more nonsense. It's there to make you believe that traditional publishers are dangerous, they're going to rip you off, they're ruthless, they're cutthroat, and they're just going to take your book, make it into whatever they want, change it, and just put it out there without any concern. And all of this is just more bias. It's a business, whether you're self-publishing or it's traditional publishing. It's there to make money for you as an individual, if you're self-publishing, to hopefully fund you to live and produce more books. And it's the same for traditional publishing. It's there to fund the business so they can pay the editors and have money in the pot to give advances to other new writers to give them a chance on their debut to get books out there. And it's all creative, yes, and it's all based upon ideas and the imagination of the writers that they're buying these great stories from. But equally, both sides of this are a business, and you need to remember that. But making it sound like traditional publishing is this great, terrible thing that's going to swallow you up, ironclad contracts, devilish contracts, don't believe them. Just don't. The next bit of advice that I saw from someone about why they wouldn't want to go down the traditional publishing route was that it essentially boiled down to it's quite tough and there's a lot of competition. They were saying, oh, there's a lot of people submitting now and a lot of, publishers and a lot more books coming out every year. And therefore, when I send my book in, it'll just get lost in the shuffle. And I've just got to, I don't really want to do that, which is making it sound like it's really hard. And I don't want to try. They might say, no, my book isn't very good. And that's why, actually, my book's brilliant. They won't read it, not because it's not good, because they just can't be bothered. Which is just, I really don't have the words. That's just like a childish response to someone saying, I don't want to do it because it's tough. Well, don't do it. But if you think self-publishing is any easier, then you're deluded. The reason your book has been rejected could be a number of reasons. It could be that the book is so weird that it doesn't work in the market and they don't think they can make any money off it. It could be that the plot is terrible. It could be that the pacing is awful. It could be that the story only gets going in chapter 20. It could be that you've written across so many genres that they can't actually sell it because they don't know where to put it in a bookshop and therefore how to sell it to people. It could be that your point of view shifts so many times that it makes no sense and you have no concept of how to write. It could be that basically any number of reasons that your book is awful. You're just not a very good writer. And competition is tough. It is hard to get noticed out there. It is hard to break in. But you're making it sound like, oh, well, it's tough, so I just don't want to do it. I'll just self-publish it and put the book out and, that'll do. If that's all you want to do, if this is what it's about, it's what is success for you? If you want to publish a book and put it out there, go down the self-publishing route, great. Fantastic, and you sell some copies, and that's what you really want. You want your work out there and in front of people, and you want them to read it. Great, do that. If you want to make a career, yes, you can do it with self-publishing. It's very, very tough, and the main difference is you have to fund all of it. With traditional publishing, you don't. They pay you. I never give money to my agent or my editor at any time. They take a percentage of the money once it starts coming in, but I never fund them. As self-publisher, you have to do the whole lot yourself. Find the editor, the proofreader, pay the cover artist, do all the marketing, do all the promotion, work with Amazon and analytics and pay-per-click and all that. You got to do all that yourself. So it's a lot more extra work with self-publishing. All I can say is, if you want to be traditionally published, you have to write a really good book. You have to make it stand out in some way. And as I said, it doesn't mean page 1, chapter 1, there's a murder and something awful happens. It's all about finding something that's unique to you, your experience, your history, your heritage, the story, the twist on the tropes, the twist on characters, something completely new that we've never seen in the genre, whatever it might be, reinventing things. That is difficult. I'm not going to say it's not, but it's just not even trying because you think it's going to be hard. Writing's not easy. If you just want an easy pass, then I don't think writing is for you. It's just not something you should try because it is difficult. The self-published market is crowded too. If you can put a book out every 3 months and everybody else is doing that, there are a lot of books coming out. As I said, traditional publishers have lists. They might put out 150 books a year, let's say, for an example. But that's not you putting out 4 books a year. That's one of your books a year. And another 149 other authors. That's, and then there are other publishers too, of course. But self-publishing is extremely crowded. It's extremely busy and extremely hard to get noticed too. So you've got to fund that. You've got to fund all the marketing and all that kind of stuff. So trying to make it sound like traditional publishing is the worst thing ever because it's a difficult place and it's really hard. It's just nonsense. Actually, I didn't really swear that much in this video. Funny that. Anyway, so I think that's all I'm going to talk about today. I look forward to your comments as always, and I'm sure there'll be some some interesting dislikes from one or two people who seem to hang around just to do that. But if you like this video, please go and check out some of the other videos that are on here. Previous Q&As, I'm doing them once a month. There's a new post. You can, in the community tab, you can go there and post some questions and I'll answer them next month. Check out the other videos I've got here on more myths about traditional publishing that I've debunked from some other people. But I'll be back next week with another video.